Welcome to Season 4 of She Ventures. I am your host, Doria Lavanino. She Ventures is a podcast about women who are pivoting in their lives and careers. We live in a world where women of color founders raise 0.5% of all venture capital in 2020, and women overall a paltry 2.2%. This podcast is about elevating women's voices. Our new website, sheventurespodcast.com, provides resources, actionable tips, mentorship, and community. We do not subscribe to the idea that there is a dearth of fundable ideas from women. There is no pipeline problem. There may be a visibility problem, and that is what we are here to fix together. Let's talk about the reality of women, money, entrepreneurship, and work-life balance on this season of She Ventures. In her early career, she focused on finance for big companies such as Prudential and Walt Disney, before pivoting to a career spanning more than 2 decades as an organizational development consultant, most recently as the founder of her namesake consulting firm in Chicago. She holds a doctorate, an MBA, and today we'll hear how she works with Fortune 100 companies on sensitive topics in the equity and inclusion space, something that we have been hearing a lot about in recent months and probably should have been for a much longer time than that. As a mother of 4, she can also speak to us about her experience with work-life balance. Dr. Kerry Mitchell Brown, welcome to She Ventures.
Thank you so much. It is so great to be here. I appreciate the invitation and so looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise. Before jumping into the diversity and equity and inclusion space, you worked in financial services. What drew you to finance?
As far back as I could remember, I was always interested in numbers, more specifically numbers in the context of telling a story of what's happening or not in business or organizations.
I like the or not, yeah.
Yeah. This interest was really birthed out of a very early experience emerging from my participation in the Futures Business Leaders of America program back in high school. So my very first job was at a national bank in my hometown of Omaha, Nebraska, where 20 hours a week, part-time after school, I worked in a department where I generated unique credit card numbers while I was finishing up my high school requirements for graduation. My entry into, it wasn't called financial services then, but my entry into financial services started back in high school. And I actually went on to majoring in finance in college and continued my career and progressions in the finance profession in many organizations across many industries for some time.
You seem to be very skilled at it because while you're being modest, you worked for some big names like Prudential and Walt Disney. Did you enjoy what you did?
I did actually enjoy working, in finance and working at large companies, sort of putting all of the pieces together and, sharing the story for how the organization is doing. While at Prudential, I worked on their IPO. So when they went public, in a very interesting time in our world and economy, it was right after September 11th.
Oh, okay.
We continued on with the plan to go public when the market was not all that great. But, very interesting. I learned a lot working in these firms earlier on in my career.
I can only imagine how difficult it would have been to try to weigh the pros and cons of going public after September 11th. But to your point, life and business have to go on.
Yeah.
You married and became a mother while you were in college. What factors, your children, your husband, what were you managing at that time? And how did you manage?
Oh my gosh. Wow. Reflecting on that now, what advice I would have given my 19, 20-year-old self back then would be quite different. I was so young and I was so busy. So at that time, I was in my second year of college. I was a new wife. I was a new mom. I was a first time homeowner and I was living away from home. I think I was actually working part time too. So I was balancing a lot. And I was terrified, if I was being honest, that I was going to drop the ball, right? I was worried that I would either drop a ball that would break or that I would drop one that would be far out of my reach to snatch back. But I managed. I managed, and the lessons that I learned along the way were quite valuable. And I did it at a age, or at a young age, and so I didn't know what I didn't know,
Right, right.
and so perhaps that was a benefit as well. I knew that for sure my personal life was important and that there were things that I needed to gain to ensure that I had the best personal life, possible as a foundation for my family and more specifically my children.
Absolutely. And having children, I have two of my own, it really changes one's perspective, I think. I mean, that's said all the time, but it really is profound in how it changes your life in a very permanent way. Can you walk us through your 19-year-old self's daily schedule? You were going to school, you had two children. Did your husband help? How did that all work?
Yeah, I married at 19. I didn't have children. I had children a year later. As 20. It wasn't a long time, but I had children at 20. Yeah, my husband at the time, he was in the military. I was in school, full time. We lived away from our family. And so I remember my first big hurdle was like finding childcare
Yeah.
because all I knew is that, your family helped you out with childcare, like your grandmother or, your mother even. But, I found a lovely woman who was referred to me by my supervisor who actually kept her youngest child in a in-home child setting. And actually this woman, her name was Lillian Bryant. And I tell you, she was 30 years older than I was, and she was everything that I needed. She actually was my best friend until her passing 9 years ago or so. We were so super close, but she was everything that I needed. So I had a ton of help, from her. So I would get up early in the morning, drop my oldest child off, Olivia, at her home. I will make it to campus. I would go to school. I'll take a couple classes. Then I would go to work late morning through early afternoon. I would go back to campus for evening classes, pick my daughter up, meet my husband home. We will have dinner, put the baby down, do homework, and go to bed, and we'll get up and do it all over again.
Wow.
Yeah, that was our life for many years. And then a couple years would pass, and then we had our second child, and we just added on to the love
Yeah.
and the excitement of young parenting, young marriage, and finishing college and having a military career.
One of the things that you touched upon is family childcare. And I think it's a great option, particularly because childcare is expensive. There are women who obviously one should vet or get a referral, but they make their income by watching a certain number of children in their home. They're very loving, and it's a very caring environment for the children as well. And so it's a win-win. It allows women who may not otherwise have the resources but have children to go to school, work, whatever else they need to do. And it allows the child to have somewhere safe and happy to be.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I remember like her rate was $55 a week forever.
Wow.
Right. And, at 20, I was like, how am I going to get $55 a week? I couldn't imagine if I had to put my kids in regular daycare, I wouldn't have a schedule that would allow for it. I mean, there were times where I needed to study for an exam or that I was so tired and I would get to her house and she would turn me around and say, the kids are asleep. Go home and get some sleep, right? She not only took care of my kids, she took care of me.
Yes.
And I needed to be taken care of as a 20-year-old young woman. I was very young. There would be times where I didn't eat and she would say, did you eat today? I was like, I don't have time to eat. And she would make me sit down and have food. And so, it was a village. It was definitely important. And she was retired. She was on a fixed income. And although it was, $55, it mattered. It mattered to her bottom line and her being able to take care of her family and her financial responsibilities as well.
One of the things that really drew me to your story is people pivot both professionally and personally. And you've done both. Can you speak about both aspects for you?
Sure.
What was, I guess, challenging and what was empowering about these changes? Maybe first starting with the professional.
So starting with the professional, I would say the thing that is, I guess there are two pivots, right? So there's a pivot from my transition from finance to more organization development. And then there's a pivot from, working within organizations and then starting my own business. My transition from finance, while I progressed both in the breadth of experience and upward mobility as it related to increase in title, increase in salary, and a broad scope of responsibility and accountability, I didn't really feel like I was moving at the pace of my other colleagues. And to be clear, when I say other colleagues, I'm specifically referring to white men and sometimes white women that I sat alongside of, within organization. There always seemed to be a moving target on the prerequisites for the next level as far as I was concerned, right? So well, let me step back a little bit. So my entry into some of these multinational organizations in the late 90s and the early 2000s was really through some targeted recruitment efforts to build the C-suite pipeline for Black women in executive positions.
Right.
And so there was like recruitment of Black MBAs through various affinity organizations like the National Black MBA Association, which I'm a lifetime member, or executive recruiters that are going out and I don't know if there's a nicer way to say it. It's like poaching high performers from organization to organization. So I have many of those experience. And being in the pipeline for C-suite roles, those are some of my early career goals, right? It's like, yes, that's where I am interested in heading. But it was always such a mystery, even today, on the pathway for Black women getting there. And I wanted to figure that out. I started to match that curiosity with practice. And so I had a unique opportunity when I worked at Walt Disney to partner with the organization development program on creating an executive development program for finance professionals organization wide. So it didn't matter if you worked in theme parks or if you worked in the studios, like what is the executive development track for finance professionals to get you right up in the pipeline.
Right.
So that's where it began from a professional perspective. And then shortly after, I enrolled in a doctoral program to understand the theory and to really get a better grasp on organizations and what transformation was really all about, both from a framework perspective, not just within, at that time, it was one organization, and ultimately shifted my career focus. And then after doing this work in several other organizations since I was at Disney, I transitioned from always working for someone or within organizations to actually working for myself and having my own firm and, partnering with organizations and organizational leaders on helping to figure that out.
What fueled that transition from going from firms to becoming an entrepreneur and a Black woman and small business owner?
Interesting enough, that leads to like my personal pivots, right? Like throughout my life, I've had many life transitions. So we already talked about being married and having children young. Also included in that, I was divorced as well. And so I spent, a good deal of time single parenting with a village of support. So I was able to surround myself with now my adult children with some amazing people, both family and friends. So it's almost unfair to say single parenting because I did not do that alone, right? I had a ton of people engaging and loving on us all through the way.
Yeah, I admire your modesty, and I'm sure that that's true, but it's still pretty remarkable that you went on to get your PhD and everything that you've done, with 4 kids. That's not easy.
Well, I had two. I had two then.
2 at the time.
Yeah, yeah. But I did get remarried almost a decade ago, and I am a mother of toddler twins, and I'll be celebrating 50 years young in less than 2 years. My pivot for working for myself really was driven by, this very busy and active life, and now having 2 additional children in my early to mid 40s and reflecting on and thinking about what's required for them. And for them, they needed a life where they were centered and everything was built around them, and not a full life of adult siblings and really engaged and busy and accomplished professional parents where we have to build or they have to sort of, wrap themselves around our lives. The best solution for me, the best solution for our family was for me to make that pivot. And so taking all that I had learned along the way and making that really work.
Can I ask, because I've experienced this myself, so I don't know if I'm projecting this or if this was part of your decision making, but when you become a mother, in law firms, they call it being mommy tracked. But the reality is that it is impossible, at least it was for me, I'll speak for myself, to do everything really well at the same time. And while organizations kind of supported me, I didn't really feel completely supported. And I felt like I kind of had to take myself out of the game in order to do my own thing and be present for my children. Was that similar to what you experienced or not?
Absolutely. I'm trying to wrap my head around my individual experience. There were trade-offs, right? And so I used to talk about this in thinking through what does it cost me to work in the organization? Those factors of cost, like what will I be missing? What do I ultimately have to give up that may be near and dear to me and that may be my children? Do they have to go to before school care and after school care so I can fit in the FaceTime that was required at work, whether it was productive time or not? And who had the ability, like who was moving up in the organization? Was it people with children, people that didn't have children, people that had, stronger support networks or whatever? It's so interesting because my dissertation study actually explored that because I was also curious too. Can we do it all or do we just lose time?
Mm-hmm.
And what were the impact the personal relationships had on our professional lives?
Mm-hmm.
Does it support or obstruct our upward career mobility, which was one measure, but also our perceived success? Like I felt in some instances that I was doing pretty well because I was spending quality time with my children. I got a chance to make it to football games and I chose to be involved in, some parent teacher things, at school, which also correlated to me not being able to move as fast on a track in my workplace for someone who had an opportunity to devote more physical time in the office. That didn't necessarily translate to them being more impactful or smarter or
Right.
even more efficient in doing their work. I think organizations are slowly changing, around that. But
What did your dissertation find? I'm curious.
okay, so my dissertation, the answer to the question is you can do it all, but just not at the same time, and
Yep.
you can't do it all by yourself. So again, when I was talking about, having this amazing support network of family and friends, it also did find that the women who had more personal relationships had higher rates of upward career mobility and higher rates of perceived success than women who had fewer or none.
That's really interesting.
Right. So mothers, marital and family roles, and caretaking, not just mothers, but caretaking responsibilities, which could include care of elder relatives
Yes.
in addition to childcare. And it was in my study focused on Black women specifically and only, so not comparative to other groups of women, but just for Black women. And it really did illustrate the way that Black women, get things done as working mothers, daughters, partners, and, navigate the organizations. And sometimes there's choices, right? And when I say that you can't do it all at once, I don't mean that you can't be a working mom, be a partner, and have a high touch career, but you can't say, well, I want more work life balance, but I want a high profile career. Sometimes those things don't work themselves out. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. There are trade offs. And just to touch on, before we move ahead to what you're doing today, what you said about elder care, there's so much, and I know this has been talked about a lot, unwaged labor that maybe some men do, but I see it mostly women doing when it comes to childcare, when it comes to caretaking of parents, etc. And it's just interesting to me. I don't know what the solution is. I have some ideas what I would like the solution to be, but it's hard.
It is hard. And it really goes back to, the conventional wisdoms on roles,
Yes.
in society and roles, within families on who picks up what. And in roles within organizations, although some things have changed, the reality is that work and workplaces have historically been designed for and by men,
Hmm.
and life or family structures, are similar. There's this assumption made about what women need without engaging women and getting those assumptions like
Yeah.
on the table. And so sometimes there are solutions which don't match up with things that women might self-determine. I think the pandemic, has started to balance some of those things out. Like women have been asking for some flex time and some ability to work from home and to have some more autonomy on their scheduling so they could engage. And men also having some new experiences, perhaps being at home working when the kids are at home, either going to school or needing to be cared for. And so I will be very interested in what emerges from an analysis standpoint and understanding, and different practices on the other side of COVID for what workplaces and organizations are really interested in doing differently.
Yes. And to your point, women have demonstrated now, it might have been through COVID, maybe not all organizations wanted it to be so, but that you can work remotely and you can be very effective. Although it is challenging with little ones at home. I will say that as well. Fast forward to the work that you've been doing for more than 2 decades. For listeners who may not understand exactly what diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies are, could you tell them just kind of high level what they are?
Sure. I would say that similar to many things, that unfortunately there isn't a shared understanding or practice on a single definition or what it is across the board for diversity, equity, or inclusion, and what it is or what it should be. What I can tell you is how I approach it. And it really starts with examining, basic human needs. What's required to make sure that basic human needs are met within organizations, right? And so it shouldn't be this separate thing that basic human needs are met within life, but perhaps not at work, where everyone has a sense of belonging, where people understand that their contributions are valued regardless as to where they sit within the organization, how long their tenure is, how big or small their paychecks are, and that there are high levels of respect. And so getting clarity on this and paying attention to this in the beginning, there is great potential to reduce or hopefully prevent any casualties along the way, or to at least predict what those casualties might be, right? And so oftentimes we would say, Black men really don't fare well in this organization because of X, 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 and X. If you can predict that, and then there's probably something that could be explored.
Absolutely. And some of the areas that would be included under this umbrella, right, term that is being used a lot suddenly now are about race, about gender and sexism, and about economic privilege and class. Those are some of the areas in which your consultancy focuses. I don't know if this is a weird question to ask, but I was curious if there's one topic that you tend to get more inquiries about than others.
Yes, given the current realities of the world, I would say the most of my inquiries are around interventions for race and racism. And it's either to address what should be done about it within organizations, or to prove that it's not an issue here.
Oh, gosh.
We don't have these problems here, or that we've done enough to address it. And so I would say that most often it is about race. And I would attribute that to what's been happening over the last couple of years.
Which to me, when I reflect upon it, it's sad that that's what it took to get it to be a more mainstream concept, because for Black women, this is, I'm sure, as you can speak to much better than I, these issues have been going on forever.
Yes, since, like we would say, since the beginning of time. I mean, it's race and racism is global and it's real. It's been baking into all of our systems, our institutions for more than 500 years. And it's great that we are talking about it. And some people and organizations are doing more than talking about it. They're actually taking it on and doing something about it. That's a good place to start, but it's not going to change what just espousing commitments to do better in the future, because the future is now.
The future is now. And one of the pieces of data that I found was that a little bit more than half in 2021 of, I believe it was Fortune 500 companies, published some sort of racial data in 2020. But only 22 companies, 4.4%, published a full breakdown in terms of equity, getting paid, inclusion measures. Like there was a lack of data. It's almost like what you were alluding to before, that a lot of organizations talk the talk, but when it comes to seeing the efficacy or even seeing what measures are being implemented, there's a little bit of a lag, I guess, for lack of a better word.
I mean, there are a number of challenges. I'm not sure we have enough time to address them all here.
Right, of course.
But one of the, I don't even say low hanging fruit. I would just say the fruit that's on the ground that we could just pick up. That the things that you report and the things that you measure are the things that you have something to do. We have statistics. We have statistics everywhere. Everything is measured. We're in a time now where it's not just about demographics. It's political.
Mm-hmm.
Organizations, they have an idea on what their makeup of their organization is, just like they have the same anxiousness around posting earnings that are underperforming.
Mm-hmm.
Racial and ethnic data is really a principal threat. Racism is a principal threat to the bottom line. Organizations have to be able to do something differently. I mean, we've moved beyond it just being a representation and demographics, and society is saying that it's not enough.
And so, with that in mind, when a firm hires you, and I'm sure there's a lot of different ways in which this could come about, but in general, how do you meet your audience where they're at? Because I would imagine workplace cultures vary. So how does that work?
I meet them where they are by first doing an analysis to determine like what is, and getting some clarity around what they actually want to tackle. Then we look to see if there is alignment for the work that they need to have done and the work that I am willing to do. Because again, the beauty about having your own firm is that you have the opportunity to say what you have the capacity for and what you have the interest on doing, right?
Yes.
And some organizations, want to do the assessment and they really don't have the capacity or the interest into doing anything further than a couple of workshops. Well, I don't do equity work that's not a part of a larger transformational effort, because training enough does not work. Workshops enough is not enough. Fast Company just released a article for a study that was done that really talks about what organizations can do to tap into the power of leadership. And it just looked at the inefficiencies of placing, and I don't want to say placing because it implies that it was not earned, but the inefficiencies of full leadership of just having women of color, specifically Black women, in higher level positions, but not in leadership positions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's still missing, and how organizations can tap into the leadership and the power of Black women specifically, right? In this article, it was published yesterday, I believe, a really good article from other diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals. But again, if it's not part of a larger organizational transformation, do you contribute? I look at, do I contribute to the harm that's being inflicted on people within the organization or within the system? Obviously, not physical harm, but
Mm-hmm.
psychological and emotional harm, because people are really looking at organizations to be sites for learning about fair treatment and equity, and certainly to be discrimination free zones.
Yes.
Anyway, it's a great article.
Thank you for mentioning it, and we will put it up on our social media. Assuming it's not behind a paywall, then it might be a little trickier, but it's good for listeners to know.
Yeah, it's they're referencing a Harvard Business Review study around putting Black women leadership into practice. And so anyway, I am really interested in seismic transformations and solutions, but I really don't know what that is until I'm engaging with firms after, we do some sort of analysis on what we hope to take up and what that means, if that's helpful.
Have you seen organizations willing to have kind of the seismic shift that you're describing?
Some are and some are not. And that's okay. I
Yeah.
mean, some organizations are not ready yet. Some organizations have not prioritized it in a way to match what their corporate espoused statements are for fighting racial justice or working towards racial justice. Again, it means different things to different organizations, and understanding what an organization's unique contribution is to this overall fight for equity. That's really the magic, right? And so we can't all do the same thing, but finding out what the unique contribution is where I try to work with specific organizations and determining on where the organization may take the lead for their particular industry, their particular region, where they may join others that have efforts moving for greater impact, or where they just follow because there are others out sort of leading the way, and they could just sort of use support. And so not every organization has to be the leader, but every organization should be doing something that's more than just offering a workshop.
Yes, there's no one size fits all. That's understandable. As a Black woman business owner, how would you say people's conscious or unconscious bias has affected you as a business owner?
I'm not sure. I would intellectually say that, as a Black woman, I assume that people make assumptions about who I am or who I may not be
Hmm.
based on, their limited understanding of who I am personally.
There are so many small businesses out there, and I was curious about the cost of implementing, and when I mean cost, I mean the actual dollars of implementing these kind of initiatives, which are absolutely necessary. Is it a cop out for small businesses to say, we just don't have the bandwidth to do this? What can they be doing at a bare minimum?
I wouldn't say that it's a cop out per se, but what I will invite them to consider is that I usually say either you can invest now or sort of go bankrupt later, right? I mean, because as a business, there is liability. There's liability for discrimination, there's liability for harm, which you can't put a price tag on,
Hmm.
or at least a known cost or a known price tag. There can be damage to your reputation. There can be damage to your brand, which you also can't put a price on. And so I, try to encourage them to think about it in phases, right? And so it doesn't happen, overnight, but what are some of the things that they can begin doing within the organization, looking at some of their policies and practices and procedures, creating a culture within the organization. And there is an ability to do more of this in smaller organizational settings and larger organizational settings, and creating an equitable culture where there are more conversations around equity and not inequities. What is a process for making dark skinned people more figural, more human?
Hmm.
That doesn't cost a whole lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's almost free.
Yeah,
Treating Black people, treating dark skinned people human, I don't know.
absolutely.
That's a good place to start for any organization, certainly small businesses.
You said that so well. It kind of brought tears to my eyes. I don't want to say I was ashamed to ask the question, but it is so true that humanity really doesn't have a cost.
Yeah, that's free. And then I get, like outside costs, like with a consultant. I mean, there are a number. I mean, every person that I talk to, every organization, every leader that I talk to, I don't always charge a cost,
Hmm.
right? I mean, there is some part of my portfolio that I reserve for small businesses who are interested in, where do I start? Like, I can't spend a ton of time with them, but I don't turn them away because they don't have the budgets to support it. I know I have a number of colleagues that are interested and dedicated to this work to where, they offer the same. And so if cost is a barrier, my question typically is, what are you really resisting?
Such a powerful question. What do you say to critics of DEI who say that you're reaching people who already think and believe theoretically in the way that you are advocating for? At the same time, you may be further alienating those who don't embrace those principles. Is that something that you hear?
I guess I do in some instances. Like, some people will say, well, you're preaching to the choir, I hear you, like I understand. And I was like, I get it. Well, help me talk to more people. Help me engage more people. Like, if you understand, help me to do some work and or continuing doing the work. And for those people that, you further alien, there's always going to be people that you don't reach. But from an organizational perspective, there are or should be rules and guidelines. So whatever you do outside of the organization should be up to you. But while you're here, here's the expectation. And if you can't operate within that, then you should be asking yourself, why do you work here?
Yeah.
And that's what I encourage organizational leaders to do to create that culture, right? It's not a requirement that you have to invite, let's say, your Black and brown colleagues to your daughter's wedding and make sure that their pictures are in all of your important family events on your Facebook page.
Mm-hmm.
But you do have to have high levels of respect within the organization, right? And so, there's the interpersonal and what you do in your life, but then these are expectations that you agree to as part of your contract for employment. So it's part of your job. It's part of receiving your paycheck, however often the payroll cycle runs, right?
Absolutely. As we wrap up and before we get into how listeners can learn more about where to find you, if there's one myth that you would like to dispel about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what would that be?
That it's not about so much demographics. It's about treating people human, treating people whole, and creating the environments in this space to where they can be.
But the myth that would be related to is on the other side.
The myth that would be related to is that people have to give something up in order for that to be possible.
Absolutely. That makes sense. This has been a very enlightening conversation for me. I appreciate the authenticity in which you speak. And I wanted you to tell listeners where they can find out more about you and your services.
Yes, I have a website and you can reach me at Kerry, and that's Kerry, mitchellbrown.com. And you will find all of my social media handles there. There's links to my email and there's also links to my social media.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It was such a pleasure and happy to join a conversation anytime in the future. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to She Ventures. Like what you heard? You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and sign up for our newsletter so you never miss a show.